Welcome to this event, Polarization and the Path to War, Iran in Perspective. I'm Daniel Rothbart, professor at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, joined by my colleague, Randy Lyles, who is the manager of our Peace Lab, Polarization and Violence Transformed. It's great that you can join us for this event about the current war in Iran. And let me just mention a couple of points before the main speakers come, and I'll introduce them in a minute. This war is obviously known now for the layers and layers of unknowns. There's just a long list that's been documented by many, many commentators of unknowns. What are the military tactics of the United States? How will Iran respond to those military tactics? What are the long-term strategies of the United States and the strategies of Israel? Are they compatible? Are they incompatible? And will Iran continue to fight and attack not only the bases and structures of Israel and the United States, but also the neighboring countries? And how will this change the geopolitical dynamics in the region? These are really unknowns, but I just want to say there's one thing that's known for sure. People are dying, and in particular, civilians are dying. And this is obviously not rare to this war, the devastation to civilians, that in virtually every long-term war, civilians basically represent a significant portion, in some wars, a majority of the fatalities, even more than the fatalities of combatants. And in this war, of course, the reports are scattered, but already the estimate is 4,500 to 5,000 people have been killed already in this war. And these represent fatalities in all of the countries that have been attacked. And there is an estimate now, and obviously it's hard to confirm this with certainty, but in Iran itself, approximately 1,500 civilians have been killed, and at least 200 of them are children. These numbers tragically are going to go up as the war continues. And of course, there's fatalities in Lebanon, at least 1,000 fatalities in Lebanon, in Israel, in Iraq, and so on. And of course, the U.S., at least 13 service men and women from the United States, and so on. So that's just one dimension of the war. Of course, there are layers of complexity, and we are so fortunate to have two experts on this and many other wars. It is an honor to have Dr. Reza Khanzadeh, who is an adjunct professor of political science, Middle East, and Islamic studies at George Mason. He is an expert on Iran. He has written and spoken extensively on Iran. In particular, he's written human rights experts that aided in the release of political prisoners from Iran in 2013. He's also contributed to research and analysis of the 2015 Iran nuclear negotiations and advised international companies and so on. It is wonderful, of course, an honor to have him serve as an expert speaker for this event. Thank you, Reza. And also joining him is my colleague, Professor Solon Simmons. He is the um, ed, um, the Ed and Minnie Lynch Professor of Peace and Conflict Resolution at the Carter School. Solon is famous for basically advancing a very important perspective for understanding conflict and conflict resolution, which is a narratological perspective. He has demonstrated the centrality of narratives in that's embedded in the conflict dynamics and the conditions for basically overcoming, resolving, or transforming conflicts towards peace. He's written many books, most recently Narrating Peace, How to Tell a Conflict Story. It is always fascinating to hear Solon speak on this and many other issues. So thank you so much, Solon, for joining us. And the way we're going to organize this event is that my colleague on this, my partner in so many events, Randy Lyos, will provide some questions, and we're going to kick it off, and then there'll be some Q&A after the speaker's primary answer to these questions. So take it away, Randy.
All right, thanks so much, Dan. It is really great to be here learning from these Mason professors about this conflict. And, personally, I don't have particular expertise on Iran, so I imagine that actually many of my preconceptions, like many others, are going to be corrected here or challenged. Really grateful that as a lab, we are able to welcome these guests and get their insights on this conflict. So I wanted to start off with you, Reza. To level set us as a group. You've studied the internal dynamics in Iran for many years, and I think that a lot of Americans probably have a fairly one-dimensional view of the country of Iran. Seeing a brutal theocracy that oppresses the people, taking away their rights, dictating how they live, and the vast majority opposing that regime and even friendly towards the United States, and really just waiting to cast off their oppressors if they only had the military might to do so. And there may be a lot of truth in that, but the situation is, of course, rarely so simple. So I would love for you to help us understand the social and political situation in Iran and whether it actually reflects even some of the types of conflict that we'd recognize here as political polarization.
Hmm. Yeah, well, first and foremost, thank you very much for having me. I'm very honored to be in the presence of such great thinkers as Dr. Simmons and Dr. Rothbart. Um, so there's a lot to unpack here, and I think in order to lay the groundwork, if you will, or to lay the foundation for our talk during this session, I need to first, I think, lay the groundwork, like a pre-groundwork for this groundwork. So if I can just go back to the 79 revolution, uh, and kind of explain the different mindsets that were involved in that uprising and that political change. It can kind of shed light on what we're seeing now, because there are some similarities and obviously there are differences, um, but that human element, and the way that people uh, spoke about their grievances and spoke about their mistrust of their government, whether it was the Shah in the 60s or whether it's now with the Islamic Republic. Those types of narratives, still exist. Those types of grievances, still exist. So looking back to the late 70s leading up to 79, to the actual, uprising itself in 1979, we have to remember that the vast majority of Iranians, they were illiterate. So the prime means of propaganda or the prime means of communication that leaders like Khomeini would utilize would be uh, more means of different types of imagery, posters and signs, things that didn't have that many words, obviously, but spoke through the arts, whether it was, graffiti or signs, like I've said. But during that uprising, there were a lot of different factions throughout Iran that opposed the Shah, that opposed that monarchy. It wasn't just the clerics, it wasn't just the Muslim community. You had communists, you had Marxists, you had um, the 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 high thinking elites, if you will, the academics. But one of the main reasons why Khomeini and his clerical establishment were able to kind of um, spearhead the movement and kind of be the face of the movement was because he understood the people he was talking to. He understood that the vast majority of them could not read or write. And while his contemporaries, the communists and Marxists and, people from those different types of groups, they were, printing pamphlets with all these paragraphs explaining why the Shah was bad and why there were, needs to be an uprising. It didn't gain traction. And even when Khomeini was exiled to Paris, he had an intricate group of individuals that would smuggle in cassette tapes. So even then, he still wasn't, publishing. He wasn't writing anything down. He wasn't sending out pamphlets because he knew the people that he was trying to mobilize and unite to rise up against the Shah, again, just wouldn't be able to follow him if it was in the means of, literature. So he recorded his speeches on cassette tapes, and, college students. One of my former professors, actually, from the University of Virginia, was a part of that team that would smuggle in cassettes, from Iraq to Iran. So that was what we were facing, or that's what the Iranian people were facing back then, right? But their grievances were very similar to what we hear now. Even though there was a strong middle class during the Shah, uh, because of his vision to westernize Iran, to try to, you know, try to essentially ingratiate, the Iranian community to this Western lifestyle. And that did, benefit a lot of people within Iran. And there was a strong middle class. Parallel and simultaneous to that middle class, there was actually another middle class as well that was um, actually headed in the opposite direction, moving more towards the lower class. And that was the class that, Khomeini was speaking to. So if we kind of, base this foundation on what we're going to talk about during this panel discussion, we have to keep that in mind. So those people that were, rising up and protesting that, eventually succeeded in the overthrow and the rise of Khomeini, that was the generation of the baby boomers, so to speak. And they're the ones that, laid the groundwork for what, became obviously the Islamic Republic of Iran. And now we fast forward to these past, I would say, really ever since 2019 and the Green Movement, this past 7 years, we have seen an increase in protests, and we've seen a rise um, in the extent to which protesters have been challenging the regime. So one thing we have to keep in mind, again, talking about that generation with the baby boomers. So now we have generation, X and generation Y, right? And from 2019 until maybe 2024, I would say, those were the two generations that we as the outside observers were mostly introduced to. Whenever there was protest in Iran, and there has been almost every year there's been protest in Iran, right? But it was usually Generation X and Generation Y that we would see on the streets protesting. It's not until these past 2 years, 2024, 2025, and now we're, going into April of, 2026, where we are introduced to a new generation of protesters, Generation Z. And this generation, this is the first This is the first generation under this regime, under the Islamic Republic, that has zero memory of 1979. They have zero memory of the 8-Year War. They have because they weren't alive during that time, right? They have no PTSD from it. They have no experiences from it. So for them, it's just a story. It's just some type of fable, some type of myth, some type of, again, story that you just read in books, right? So it doesn't really mean much to them. It doesn't resonate to them. There's no visceral, response from them when they hear stories of this. Now, I'm from, Generation Y. My sister's from Generation X. I was born in 82, so I was in Iran during the 8-Year War between Iran and Iraq, which was from 1980 to 88. We didn't stay for too long, obviously. We did flee the country and come to America. But that's that's the dynamic that we see now, that when you talk to Iranians inside Iran, again, so right now, the, population in Iran is 93 plus million people. And to get a sense of what 93 million people are thinking is impossible, right? But you do your best, me having done field work, having done my works, my research, in Iran, having interviewed hundreds, if not thousands of people, many of which are within the regime. And then I kind of corroborate that with other, academics who have also done field work in Iran. We can kind of piece together what we believe the different views are as far as what the people inside Iran think of this regime and how they think the future of this country should look like. But even that's broken down again by the different generations. If you ask people within generation X and Y, you'll get a lot of mixed emotions, mixed views. Some will say that all we want is just more freedoms. We're okay for this regime to be in place because at least that does give us some type of stability, but we just want more freedoms. Others say no, we want regime change, but there's this PTSD that comes with that regime change because again, they have lived it in the 80s and 90s. And for the most most people within that Generation X and Generation Y camp, they just don't want to start all over again. They don't want to start from scratch and have to rebuild the nation all over again with a new government and not knowing what that government's going to look like. But then if you talk and interview, people within, Generation Z, like I said, because they don't have any PTSD, they don't have memories and experiences, they want regime change. The vast majority of them want regime change. They want to start all over again. They want to wipe the slate clean, so to speak, of this government and move on to something else. Um, but that kind of dynamic speaks to the level of complexity that even when this war is over and the dust settles, so to speak, and there is some elements, some chance of some type of conversation to maybe have some kind of reform, even the protesters themselves can't agree on what they want this country to look like. And that level of polarization in Iran uh, does does mirror a little bit of what we've been seeing during the Trump administration's first term and even now in his second term, where now it's no longer a conversation of Democrat versus Republican. Now, even those two political parties have these, denominations within them, right? You have the far left, far right, you have the MAGA. So you have all these different factions that see things differently and what they want their country to look like. And there are elements like that in Iran as well. More so now, like I said, because of this new generation, Generation Z, that is a part of this conversation. They have entered this narrative with much more veracity, much more anger, much more hatred, because, like I said, all they know is what they've experienced. They don't have anything else to compare it to. So for them, this is the worst of the worst. But if they ever talk to someone in my generation, Generation X, or even, the baby boomers, we could tell them stories that it could be a lot worse than this. Like, but they don't believe us, they don't trust us, they blame us for the conditions that they're in. And there's a serious divide there that, in my opinion, I don't think can be very much remedied because, again, if we trace all the protests from 2019 until now, there really hasn't been, uh, for a lack of a better term, there really hasn't been a leader. There hasn't been this one person that can stand with a microphone or like a blowhorn on a stage or somewhere and say, I represent the people that are protesting. The way that Khomeini did back in 79, these protesters don't have someone like that. And there's two reasons to that. One is whoever were to stand up and be that spokesman, so to speak, or be that leader, the regime would quickly, do away with that person. They will find a way to make them disappear one way or another. But I think there's a more complex reason, and it goes back to what I was saying about the different generations, the different mindsets. They just can't agree. They can't agree. The protesters can't agree, even to a consensus level of what they would like the future of Iran to look like and how to have one person or like a handful of people represent them in that uprising. Um, I can keep going on and on if you want, if I have more time. But I can stop there if you want to,
No, I
but
mean this is fascinating, and as you've been talking, I think a lot of us are hearing parallels between what Iran experienced and what we are experiencing now. Especially, when you towards the beginning of your comments, you talked about the difference in directions of different segments of society, and the way that Khomeini was able to harness the resentment of those who were on the downward path, right? And obviously we've seen a lot of that here. I wanted
that's
to give
right.
Solon a chance to weigh in, especially because Solon, you focus on conflict narratives, and as Reza has been laying out, there are so many of those narratives that are competing on both sides. Within both countries. It seems like half of which the Trump administration has actually tried out as narratives for supporting this war. And I wanted to ask you, with such complex narratives, does it make it more challenging for the two countries and their ruling regimes to understand one another, to actually make progress in moving towards peace or resolution?
Well, thank you, Randy, and thank you, Reza, for your comments and for your inside point of view. So interesting to hear someone who, has an insider feel for what's happening. I wanted to speak about let's say, the narrative point. What is it? Well, first of all, what is a narrative point of view, and how does it help us to make sense of this situation? And as much, Randy, as you're putting forward the idea that there's so many and complex narratives, I might say something a little different, which is to say, it's too simple, and because it's so simple right now. One of my colleagues, our colleague Sarah Cobb, always talks about introducing complexity into a story, and I like to talk about that as moral complexity, which is what we don't have right now. And I'd be interested to engage in reflecting on more what is happening and potentially inside the Iranian regime. But I want to just focus first on what's happening in the United States discourse, and to start my comments with being a little pessimistic. Pessimistic in the sense that I believe that in a couple weeks it's going to be much worse. And I'm going to try to explain to you why I think in a couple weeks, whatever talk we're seeing about, oh, maybe there's peace talks, and oh, maybe this and there's maybe that, and will the oil prices finally course this president? I do not think so. And I think that he's going to escalate, and I think that there will be a very difficult situation coming. So I want to get inside why I think that is, and it actually has something to do with this being too simple. And here's how I'd want it. And in fact, it's such a simple claim that it's difficult to absorb it in many respects. And that's the problem of story. So let me just begin with a couple comments. So I want to say we don't experience political conflict directly. We're not there. Even Reza's not there. We're not experiencing this thing. As Walter Lippmann, the famous journalist, said about war, it's only pictures in our heads that we have. We have images. And that's the basis of public opinion about war. Even if you're in it, you're getting news from the Capitol, from the front lines, and so on. So what we have to do is we have to understand how those pictures work and how they're structured. And I think they're structured through stories. I think that's the best way to think about it. Stories as a not as a kind as simply a form of witness, but as a cognitive mechanism, as a way that we process and make sense of the world. So when we talk about sense making, we're talking about narrative. We're talking about story structure. And stories, they organize what we see and also what we feel. So this is as much about emotion right now as it is about a rational policy argument. In fact, I think what's so difficult for so many, maybe the reason, Randy, you say, oh, there's so much complexity and what have you, is that it really is that complex. But right now, it seems like it's really simple, driven by the emotion of the moment. And the president seems to be happy to channel that emotion in the way that he would like. And in that sense, much of this conflict, in my view, is pre-conscious. That is not, it's not unconscious. It just happens already. And then we look for reasons to justify what's happening. And I'm making this not just as a metaphor, but as a structural claim about how human beings organize suffering, how they attribute agency, and how they imagine their future. And what I want to ask us to look to is to figure out to encourage us to engage in a form of self-knowledge. Why isn't the United States doing this right now? Why is this happening right now? It's clear that what Iran has been much like this for a very long period of time, leadership for 47 years. This didn't have to happen right now. There's all sorts of arguments about timing, but I think there is a reason it's happening right now, and I'd like to get inside that a bit. And the way I'm going to ask the question or answer it is by asking, what story are we inside? We are being told by a story. We are playing a story out, is my argument. This story is happening to us. It isn't something we're choosing necessarily. Well, the president of the United States is choosing it. That's the only person who's choosing it. But we are not, and we are participating, therefore, in that story. And it's a story about Iran and where it fits in our lives. And I think the generational comment is very interesting. I'm the generation of Generation X, somebody who lived through the 444 days, somebody who thinks of that as a much bigger event than 9/11, where that reorganized my world and how I thought about the world. And therefore, everybody who's a person my age who lived in the United States, and I don't mean people who are 70, I mean people who are in their 50s, lived through that and thinks of that as a fundamental reorienting event that they then translate to others and teach them about. For good or ill. So quickly, just the way I want to talk about stories is that I think of these things in terms of relational grammar. And what you've got is you've got a protagonist function and you've got an antagonist function. The protagonist is your side. And who's our side? Our side in this thing is the United States. And they are the regime, the Death to America regime. And so we have the agency, we have the activity that's going on, and we have the value that supports it. But importantly, not only is it on that side is not simply the regime, but it's the wound that we feel. We feel that wound, and that wound is the thing that is acting right now. That wound is the thing that is demanding an answer. And Donald Trump, being as savvy as he is, you can think whatever you like about Donald Trump, he knows that wound, he can smell it. He knows exactly where the flies are gathering, and he's moving toward that wound when he can. These stories organize our suffering, and there's two different kinds. This is, if you're interested in what I do and the way that I think about conflict and story, this is the big distinction that I like to make between, on the one hand, a villain story where there is a bad guy, a person, an antagonistic force you can identify, what I call the villain arc, and on the other side, a flaw arc. And a big part of what I would say needs to happen for the United States to have any hope of preventing a catastrophe, and I'm not even sure how we do that at this point, given this president and the fact that only the midterm elections are going to send the signal that would be of the sufficient size. But the only hope we will have even then will be to try to work on what I call the flaw arc and to downplay the villain arc. That is to say, we're going to have to learn to see Iran in complex terms, not merely as villains, the Death to America, burn the flag, humiliate the West kind of perspective, but instead as part of a complex, flawed system, a hinge of civilization right there in the middle of everything, something too complicated to leave. We should have known that this was too much for us to accept, everyone did know that the Strait of Hormuz would be shut down. Everyone did know that this would be the outcome. The president knew, and people are accusing him of not knowing. He knew exactly what was going to happen, and he also knew that since President Obama's time, the United States has diversified out of that region. in terms of its oil exposure. Does not have oil exposure and natural resource exposure there. Most of the oil does not come in the same way that it did in 1979. The lesson was learned, and it was learned by President Obama and President Biden. And President Trump won. And now the resource independence is such that they can impose harm and suffering more on our Asian allies and competitors than on us. So we can survive this thing longer than you would otherwise think, especially if you don't care much about public opinion, which this president clearly does not right now. And the reason he doesn't right now is because he knows that if he can get the story right, if he can complete this villain arc, then he scores a touchdown. And I'm using that metaphor explicitly to appeal to American sensibilities. He can get the big win, the Hail Mary pass that he's going to need because he's at 33% popularity right now. And if he doesn't do that, then he's going to lose big. And we know what happened last time when he lost the Congress. He's not going to be able to survive. So what the goal would be for anyone who cares about peace, who cares about policy, complexity, is to try, therefore, to introduce this moral complexity in what I call the flaw arc. And here's how the flaw arc, you know the villain arc, I don't have to explain it. What is a flaw arc? And I'm going back to classic notions of tragedy. You can think of Achilles and the Iliad. You can think of any number of stories of tragedy, even Sita and the Ramayana. Every culture has a tragic story of this kind and often narrates its past in this way. What is the flaw arc? Suffering is attributed at least partly to internal incompletion. That is a tragic story, and this is our colleague Sam Hardy talks about this. When we tell a tragic story, we accept our own complicity. We accept that we helped contribute to this problem. So when you talk to anybody who knows anything about Iran, you say, oh, 1979, and immediately they say, oh, 1953, Mossadegh, you CIA, you did it. And do you think anybody who's in the Republican Party who's my age cares about 1953? They don't. They don't care at all. What they do care about is 1979 and the humiliation that the United States has suffered their entire lives. Their entire lives, they've been humiliated. And now is the moment for revenge, and they're going to get it. That's the idea. So this is a very dangerous moment because we have to then recognize that we help to contribute to this situation. Part of the reason why Iran has not been able to move forward is because of that 1980s war. Part of the reason is the tremendous trauma and death and suffering. We don't even know about this war. And it marks people in such a profound way. I mean, think about the Civil War in the United States and how we still talk about it like it's yesterday. The 80s were an incredibly destructive period of time. And Iran and the Iraq War was in a way trying to get back into that situation, punishing our guy who didn't get the job done. But now this is going after the direct source of that wound, much more than Osama bin Laden. I want to really emphasize this. Iran is a bigger deal than Osama bin Laden was. So this is important to recognize. So in a flaw arc, there's not someone to blame. You don't blame anybody. You fix something. You find something to fix. This is the idea of a problem. Why do we do problem-solving workshops? It's not that you did it. There's a problem. We suffer from it together. We need to figure this thing out. And we've got to get into that mode somehow. We've got to get elites. There are many members of both parties who are able to see the world in this way. But right now, the story is telling them they can't stand up to the story right now. It's too powerful, not with this president, and not with the taste of blood he had in Venezuela. And this is no Venezuela, by the way. And this is my view. I mean, I'll defer to him, but I see nothing that's similar to what's going on in Venezuela at all, apart from oil reserves, apart from the ability to control natural resources. This regime, there may be 200,000 people in this regime who are going to fight to the death. I mean, there are a lot of people who are very well established, who've been planning for this basically my whole life. And so this is going to keep going. So you need to recognize that you need to fix something. You need to understand the other. We have something in ourselves that we need to think about. And most of what we do at the Carter School is trying to get, especially those in the West, to see themselves, see their own contribution, to put this in the sense of empire, if you like, or colonialism, if you like, or interdependence mismanaged, if that's better for you, whatever it is, to recognize those challenges and to turn that story in a more complex direction. And right now, we're not going to introduce complexity on the Iranian side. That's up to them, especially since we've just killed their whole leadership cadre. We've lost control of that. That's out of our hands. Now what we have to do is we have to set our own house in order. And this arc is harder. It's not as obvious. It requires a willingness to turn the lens on oneself. You have to open space for transformation. Not, the villain is easy. It's fun. It's good. It's like, oh, this person did it. These terrible people. Let's go after them. But it's not going to. It actually is not a very very helpful way to move forward, especially in a really complicated situation. And that's where, Randy, I would say I agree. The actual situation, the actual policy situation, is incredibly complicated. The stories are not. That's where I think we're in trouble. And it's worse. And this is where I would say that I want to invoke this notion of chosen trauma, which is very typical for us in the field. Because you didn't have to be an old guy like me to live through this, right? You don't have to be around in 1979 to recognize that this is the closing chapter to the opening of the book of 1979. You just have to have heard about it. Because now, if you watch Fox News, everybody who watches Fox News knows 1979, bam, 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 bam. You hear it all the time. But if you're not watching that in that media space, you might not even really think, oh, 79, what happened in 79? And what, oh, I forgot what's going on. But I tell you, that's being rehearsed in the right media channels. And what's important about a story in this way of a founding wound, this is a founding wound. And I can't emphasize this enough. And I'm telling you, if those of you who are older than me in this call maybe don't feel it the same way as people my age do, we do. We feel this thing. And we didn't even remember we felt it. We're like, oh, yeah, that sucked. You know what I mean? That sucked. And then you're like, right, remember Jimmy Carter? He was a terrible president. He was humiliated. And I worked for the Carter School. Ronald Reagan came and he set the world right and so on. All of that is based on, in many respects, not just the stagflation, but this situation in Iran. That's our founding wound we're dealing with, right or wrong, the simple story. And every subsequent encounter with Iran, therefore, I would argue, and you're seeing this rehearsed on Fox News and other places, Drudge Report and New York Post and so on, the Marine barracks bombing, just another scene in the story. The nuclear program, the proxy conflicts, the various moments of negotiation and confrontation that went nowhere, the IEDs killing the soldiers, the MRAPs that had to protect our soldiers in Iran. It's just another scene in the story, the same simple story, that's my point, whose verdict has not yet been established. The verdict is not yet set. We're waiting for the end of the movie. And this guy, this president, loves to run life like a movie or a television show. We're living the movie. And these positions were assigned back in 79, and they're still ongoing. It's part of our common sense, as Antonio Gramsci, the theorist, would argue. We've taken this into our basic prototypes of international policy. This is how we do it. The chosen trauma notion, therefore, the younger people encounter the story in an even simpler form because you might have learned it for the first time. I mean, if you're 20, you start to learn about these things. And, if your parents didn't tell you and what have you, you're just kind of taking in the news and whatever's available now. But you might even live it in a more extreme way. So I think that this idea that this is the danger that I see right now. There's only one form of resolution for a story like this when you're fighting evil, and that is to defeat the evil. And what Donald Trump is really excited to do, a friend of mine described it this way. If you remember the famous Muhammad Ali I think it was Frazier poster where he's standing over him and he's like, that's who Donald Trump wants to be. He wants to be the guy. He wants to be Muhammad Ali in that picture. And it's Iran who's on the mat, and he's going to be the one doing it. That's how he sees this situation. And until he gets there, he's not going to stop, or until we stop him. And it's got to have to be us in the United States to stop him, because there's no one else who can stand up to this guy right now. The Europeans cannot do it. They have no idea what to do. They're completely at a loss about what to do with this guy. And they haven't even seen him unleash the army yet. We have not seen the machine that he's getting ready to unleash. You will be shocked. Russia has nothing like this. When these guys get going, they've been training for this. When they go to Isfahan to get the nuclear materials, they're people whose whole career is just about doing that one thing, gaming it out, using AI to figure it out. How do we get there? Do we go with the cranes and the backhoes and the this? And how do we have a corridor with the Marines? It's all there ready to go. And it's going to be brutal. Especially with Pete Hegseth, who revels in the brutality. I mean, I'm just shocked. I'm shocked at the way in which this story is just fully throated as if, I mean, it's like a fantasy. It's like we're living in a fantasy, and it's just remarkable to see how this thing is happening. So what do we do? I mean, I want to say something about. So what does that mean for us? Because I think this is what we're interested in. So every master narrative like this, every narrative that has survived sometimes decades and even centuries, it organizes our experience, and it contains both arcs potentially. That is, the flaw arc is there. Americans know that we have not done everything right. There's a very powerful group of people, senators, business people who recognize it. We know that that the flaw story is there. We have to somehow be ready for the flaw story. It's not going to work the next 2 weeks. I'm sorry, it's just not. We're going to have to wait to see what happens and then react to it. But we have to be ready with that flaw story and understand what's there and be able to sell it. The most important thing is this: you can't shame a majority. De Tocqueville told us this, and I think where Democrats have gone wrong, the reason we're in Trump 2.0 is we keep trying to shame the majority in the United States, to shame the 51% who vote one way, and say you did the wrong thing. No, you have to appeal to their self-interest. You have to say, hey, do you recognize this was not the way you wanted to go? Do you know that there are 90 some million people in Iran? The history there's the money you could make there. Well, how good it would be if Iran were healthy and happy and contributing to the world. I mean, these folks fought the Roman Empire and they outlived them. I mean, there's so many stories you could tell that would be, somewhat close to true, but that would be very powerful and that would get people aware of what could come out the other side, and to realize that what we're doing right now is planting the seeds for our own villain. I mean, who looks like the villain here? I hate to say this. I don't want to speak against my country, but I do want to say, if you were to describe who looks like the cartoon villain, I think that the Secretary of War is a good candidate for that. Because, if you were to script the cartoon villain, the things he says, we're kicking them when they're down. That's what cartoon villains say. And so that there's something odd in which the quiet part is being said out loud now, that makes me worried about what the future is, because how can you expect the moderate Iranian to be sensible when something like this that the entire world now sees is not sensible has happened? Let me just close with this. What it does is it gives us a wonderful opportunity to recognize our own failings. Meaning, I think it's going to be very hard for anyone to say, hey, 5 years from now, that whole Trump thing, that was exactly what it should have been. No, that's not what we're going to be thinking. It's not going to be like that. Even if you love his policy, even if you hold your nose and say, well, it's the best we could do, whatever, people are not going to like the look and feel of this. This is not going to feel good. They're not going to want to associate with that. And so it'd be very easy to work on that sense that there were things that we did that contributed. Here's the easiest way to think about a tragic story: to use Alcoholics Anonymous in the way that a person is supposed to introduce themselves there, which is a space of social transformation. You're supposed to enter into that with a tragic mentality of yourself. And the way you would say it is this: it'd be something like this. Hello, I'm Joe Schmo, and I'm an alcoholic. That's how you have to start to recognize your own weakness, to recognize what's wrong with you, what you did, and it's not anyone else's fault. It's not your wife, it's not your mom, it's not your job, it's you. And right now, this has a lot. I mean, I'd say that this, as much as Iran is not a regime that I want to say any good thing about, what I want to say, the timing and the way this is happening has to do with us. And therefore, if we don't look to what's going on in the United States and how we're doing things right now, I don't think there's much hope to getting onto a better path. At the same time, you can't play out an arc like this forever. People will not tolerate it, and the United States is fast losing its allies. So the question is, how do we get outside of this story and start telling a different one?
Yeah. So, and I really appreciate that framing, and that really does set us up for a better understanding of especially how folks in the U.S. Are thinking about this conflict. And and Reza, I do want to give you a chance to respond. I think we have a bunch of folks who would like to ask questions, and so I wanted to just do a quick lightning round, and I wanted to just pose this idea about so as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about Carter School alum Tatsushi Arai has written about the idea of functional coexistence, where the leaderships of rival countries, they work themselves into a stalemate, and a lot of times it is because of the narratives that are incompatible, and it results in a lack of recognition of one another. They can't talk because they can't even recognize one another. And so, Reza, I wanted to ask you about the idea of there's an idea put forward that we should still have everyday peace. From McGinty, that there's this idea that that other sectors of society can still communicate, but of course, with Iran, that is very difficult because of the restrictions on both travel and communication. So I wanted to understand, is there a way for folks in the US and folks in Iran to actually communicate, to be able to transcend some of these narratives that are that are frozen within the top levels of our countries, and have any impact on this through those relationships?
That's a good question. So from the U.S. perspective, I would say uh, absolutely. Um, getting getting different types of narratives and different types of stories out just through social media. But unfortunately, in Iran, I'm sure you all know with this conflict going on right now. We're well past a month, going into our fifth week, and there's been essentially a complete internet blackout. Um, and that's something that this regime is very well versed in. I've in my in my previous talks that I've given in my previous lectures, I always make this comment that this regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, could give a master class on how to um, suppress a population, on how to essentially kill an uprising, or how to psychologically destroy its opposition or its adversary. Because what we see in the public sphere, or what we see on social media, or what we see on open source types of documents and what have you, all those stories we see, and for the vast majority of it, it's true about the level of suppression, about the level of crackdowns. But one thing we hear very little about is the covert operations that this regime has conducted, essentially from childhood, with a lot of these citizens. And this is my book that's actually coming out in the fall talks about this. It talks about the covert aspect of this regime that not many people know, and you wouldn't know unless you were born and raised in the system. And then you get to a point of intelligence where you're like, oh damn, like everything that they've told me and everything that they've taught me is wrong. Um, and what's fascinating there is that they learn about that. They have that aha moment while they're still in the system, while they're still uh, under the umbrella of this regime, and kind of being bombarded with these covert psychological elements. So I say that to say that even with that kind of dialogue that has the potential to really connect the everyday ordinary Iranian citizen to their counterparts in Virginia, or not Virginia, obviously Virginia, that's where I'm at, but just America, or even Europe. It's it is difficult on multiple fronts, not just from a tech, not just from technology and not being able to connect to the internet, but also from that psychological level, that I don't even know who I'm talking to on the other end. Like, if I post something and if it's public, who's going to see it? Who's going to find it? Are they going to find out where I am? Are they going to see where I'm posting it from? And then the next day there's a, knock at my door, and I go missing. Um, so there is that level of um, unknown trauma, if you will, because until they have that aha moment, they don't know that there's trauma there, right? So there's that psychological element, like I've been saying, and my book kind of unpacks all this from middle school to high school to college. That there's this constant grooming where the regime, it's all in all its tentacles of influence, are telling the people, this is who we are. This is what we've gone through. It's kind of like what Dr. Simmons was talking about how Generation X in America has that level of embarrassment because of the Iran, because of the U.S. hostage crisis that lasted 444 days. That kind of psychological element also exists in a lot of people inside Iran. But again, this goes back to my previous talk about, now which type of generation are you talking to? Again, if it's the newer generation, Generation Z, that's not so much the case. but these aren't individuals. This is not a, demographic yet that has that level of authority or power to really move a movement, right? Because they're still in college, they're still young, they're still trying to figure things out. And for the most part, they're still, they have one foot out the door, so to speak. They're trying to find ways to just leave the country. And that plays into the psychology as well from this regime, where it's almost like they want you to bend the knee, so to speak, to the regime. They want you to be subordinate to the regime. And if you're not, then they find other ways to just let you leave. Because in their mind, all the opposition to the regime is those that go to the streets and protest. So if we can't stop them there, then we'll just make them leave somehow. So it's not really a pull from another country that all these youth and all these, bright minds want to leave Iran. It's a push. It's a push from the regime, and they're, pushing these people out because that's the threat. That's who they see. So all of these factors play into the mind as far as how we might be able to, amplify those types of dialogue between everyday ordinary Iranians with their counterparts in America or Europe. To really break through that requires it's actually it's really on point to what Dr. Simmons was saying. It's taking that internal look and kind of seeing the self and how do you fit into this narrative, how you fit into the storyline, to where none of us really from the outside can change their mind. They being the people in Iran, we can't change their mind and say you have to post more, you have to talk more about this, you have to reach out to your counterparts, because there's that psychological element where they're like, well, I don't know, like what if, because at the end of the day, the most important thing to Generation X and Generation Y is paying the rent, paying the mortgage, putting food on the table, making sure there's a roof over their kids' heads. They would love to see regime change. They would love to see more freedoms. But if they had to choose between the two, they're going to want to feed their kids. So to kind of break through that, and again, that's another psychological element from this regime. They know there's this there's this dark joke, a really dark joke in Iran that people say if you want to keep if you want to keep an Arab uh, insubordinate to its regime. Because if you compare the Islamic Republic to all the other governments in the Arab Muslim world, they're all dictators, right? Like what level of dictatorship are they? Are they more benevolent or not? That's a whole other conversation. But we can, for the most part, agree they're all dictators, right? And there's this dark joke in Iran that people say if you want to keep an Arab subordinate to its government, keep its belly full. If you want to keep an Iranian subordinate to its government, keep its belly empty. And that's what this regime has been able to really capitalize on, where they and we see in the West that one criticism of this regime is mismanagement of blank, right? Mismanagement of funds, mismanagement of whatever the case may be. And they say because of this mismanagement, it's the people that are suffering. I make the argument that it's not mismanagement, it's dismanagement. This regime knows what it's doing, purposefully making sure that its people starve, to where when they have to make a decision of should I rise up and protest and topple this regime, or should I just pay my bills and food, feed my kids, which one am I going to pick? They're going to pick feeding their kids. And that's been a part of this regime's again, covert operation in trying to make sure that its people stay subordinate, stay, starving essentially, so that the regime itself can, thrive and prosper and be able to, spread its, propaganda, not just throughout the country, but throughout the region. So all of these different elements we have to keep in mind when we ask the question, how can we increase that level of dialogue between the ordinary everyday Iranian and their counterparts in America? It's just, like I said, from the US side, it's easy, right? We can make that happen. We can, and we've done things like that. I've worked for a lot of Iranian organizations that were able to do those types of campaigns, if you will, or be able to have these online classes and courses where the only students we would admit were people inside Iran, to kind of raise their awareness, teach one person, and hopefully they teach 10 and so on, right? But then from the Iranian standpoint, from that perspective, even if someone like myself who might have the best of intentions to go to Iran and try to do something like this, instantly they would be like, are you a spy? Who are you working with? Who do you know? there's always this level of suspicion. There's always this level of fear as well, where they're like, I can't fully trust you. Even when I was doing my field work, as a student from the University of Oxford, trying to, interview mid to low ranking officials within the Iranian government, they were very, suspicious of who I was, and like and very, indirect ways. They were like, "Oh man, Oxford, that's great. I would love to see your student ID, just to take a picture of it to say that I spoke with someone at Oxford," right? They say it that way, right? But that's not what they mean. They were like, "I don't believe you. I need to see proof that you're actually a student from Oxford." So I showed them, but that's like that level of, mistrust and distrust that they have, that even from an official within the regime who's in the system, if they have that level of suspicion, then God help us for like the everyday ordinary citizen. I know we're kind of short on time. I think I'll stop because I
Okay. Well,
want to get the
Reza, I
questions.
mean,
But there's
yeah,
so
thank
much more. I mean, it's
Yeah,
yeah. Go.
absolutely. This is such a rich conversation, and so I know that Dr. Rothbart actually has something to contribute as well. We have questions. We have some raised hand with questions. We have questions in the chat. I was actually wondering if it would be possible, if Reza and Solon, you would be able to stick around for a little bit longer, or if you have a hard stop at 3 o'clock. We are recording this, so folks who have to leave would be able to see that.
I
Would that be
have a hard
possible?
stop. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I
So
can
can
stick around. I can stick around for
uh
a little bit
sure. Yeah, that would
if
be
you want.
great. And so Solon, I would love to give you a chance to, a minute or so, just give maybe a reaction, maybe a sum up, and then I want to bring in Dr. Rothbart to make a comment, and then we can get to some questions. So Solon, go ahead.
So let me just react to Randy, your question about the Tatsushi Arai put forward in the notion of everyday peace. I think that we've talked a lot in the field about neoliberal peace, and many people didn't like neoliberal peace and they couldn't wait for it to be over. It's over, and this is what it looks like. And the problem is that now I actually think we're in a period where we need to go back toward big peace. And in a way, even Trump's peace board or whatever the heck where you buy your access to it, whatever it is, even that's a signal of where I think we are. I think we are basically the functional equivalent of the 1870s. I think that what the peace movement was in that period of time, the same peace movement that gave birth to the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, and the United Nations, the League of Nations, the United Nations, as well as all of the various peace societies that still exist, the ILO and other societies across Europe and other places. I think we're back there. I think we're in a period where the Pax Americana is over. And that's why we're behaving in this way. We're behaving as a weak power, not a strong power. You don't do this when you're strong. You do this when you're weak because you're desperate. And so we are now trying to exert ourselves, and I'm speaking as the United States, against China, the rival we see as the rising power that we are now going to confront. And we need a movement that bridges. It still works at the level we can get access to, that middle out, people we know and things you could do, but it requires us to think bigger. And it's not just going to the global south and hoping we can surface some voices, which is critical work to do too, but it's working specifically with two leaders who can somehow convince these parties who are the principals to engage in more reasonable ways, because I think the competition is going to become worse. Russia's economy is smaller than Texas or similar size. They're not going to be a main player apart from their nuclear weapons as we go forward. But this thing with China, Europe is going to have to figure out what it's going to do. Europe is spinning. Like, what do we do? Where do we live in this world? There are all sorts of middle powers. They're trying to figure out, hey, we can't trust the United States. What do we do? I think big peace is the next answer, which means we've got to have a peace movement on a scale we have not had in any of our lifetimes. Even those of us who are in our 90s, I think I saw Chris Mitchell on the call, have never seen the peace movement I think needs to happen. So that's what my summary and pitch would be.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Solon, and it's been great having you here. I did want to give Dan a chance to jump in. Dan, I'm gonna
Randy,
spotlight
we
you as
should have
well.
had 2 hours. Come on.
I know,
We
right?
should have planned this. I'm so sorry that we didn't. Sorry to the speakers, but I have
We should do
so
a
many
part
things
two.
to,
Right.
yeah. I have so many things to say. I really so impressed with what we've heard so far. I just want to mention that Solon's comment. I'm so agreeing with the power of preconscious structured, preconscious thoughts. And I think Solon would agree that first of all, I want to make it even more complex. There's multiple pre-conscious structures because there's multiple pre-conscious stories that kind of tap into our kind of subconscious, pre-conscious, and they resonate under different catalytic conditions. Combined with that is that different segments of society have different stories, obviously. The story that emerges, for every war is that large segments of the war's participants, including civilians are participants of war, if civilians on the enemy side, they, of course, they have preconceived stories, but when you're the target of bombs and you see children dying, that kind of experience is just so overwhelming. And this gets into kind of the psychosocial tragedy of war. We call it PTSD or whatever we call it. That then creates its own future story. So what we have now is layers and layers of first evolving stories from the past and new structures being created right now for people who are subject, including the Israelis. I mean, the Israelis go through basically multiple structures of this. I mean, and the pattern, obviously, of being victims and so on and so on. All right, so that's all. I have so many other things to say,
Sure.
and Reza, I really learned so much more from what you said.
And
Appreciate
yeah,
it.
thanks for
Thank you. Means a
that
lot.
contribution, Dan. And appreciate you putting your question in the chat.
Okay, I can put it, let me this can be tied a bit into what I was saying before, as far as the everyday ordinary, Iranian who either has to decide between an uprising to change the regime or to feed its kids, right? If we take that mindset and we kind of implant it into the regime itself, so now we're squarely just looking at the regime. And again, my book kind of unpacks this. There's essentially two main camps in Iran, irrespective of generation, irrespective of ethnicity, irrespective of religious beliefs, irrespective of everything. Just on a national level. I think one thing that this conflict has shown us is how nationalistic Iranians are, regardless of their ethnicity, their political views, and what have you. So in that framing, there's essentially two camps. And these are phrases that are used colloquially within Iran. So if you're not inside Iran, or if you're not well versed in Farsi literature, you probably won't know these terms. But this is one element that my book unpacks, and it's the khodi versus the ghair khodi. Khodi means the insiders or us, and then the ghair khodi is the outsiders or the others, right? And historically, well, modern history, since the revolution, since 79, the term khodi almost exclusively meant, or it almost exclusively had a political connotation to it, where if you believed in the regime, if you pledged allegiance to this regime, if you had any connection to it, whether it's through marriage, through bloodlines, or through political parties, you would be considered a khodi. And then Beta Khodi would be those still in the system, but wanting things to be different, wanting to have some type of reform. But 40, plus years later, 4 decades later, those two terms have taken on essentially a life of their own, where now Khodi still means the regime, still means the government, but now Beta Khodi just means everyone else. Okay. But then in that dynamic, you have the active khodi, the passive khodi. So the active us and the passive us versus the active outsiders and the passive outsiders. And when I was, mentioning earlier about, Generation Z and how they want regime change by, any means necessary, they are the active outsiders, right? But then you talk to Generation X, Generation Y, and they're like, yeah, we want change, but we don't want to start all over again. We don't want to start from scratch. Because there's the fear of the unknown, and we've, been through that already. We don't want to do it again. That's the passive outsiders. Those are the people that you really don't see out in the streets too much. Those are the people that are having to decide whether to feed their kids or to spend their days and nights protesting out of fear of either getting, incarcerated or shot at or murdered or what have you. So we have that, right? And then we go back to the Hudi or the insiders, us. You have the active Hudi. Those are the ones that you see taking up arms. We talk about what a, you know, ground or land invasion would look like from the U.S. perspective. And you see, you hear a lot of military experts talk about how, the Iranian government has at least 500,000 soldiers ready to fight. I would put that number in at least 1 million. But we're talking about 90 million in this country and only about 1 million who would be willing, or no, I'm sorry, 1 million who are ready to fight. And then you probably have another 1 million who would be willing to volunteer to fight, right? So that would be the active, the active Houthi, the active us, right? They're the ones that vehemently oppose any kind of outsider foreign influence who wholeheartedly support this regime and everything it stands for and are willing to kill for it. Even its own citizens, even its own people, they're willing to kill for this regime to survive. But then you have the passive Houthi, the passive, insiders, who for them it's just a paycheck. Similar to how that parent or that protester has to decide between protesting and feeding its kid. It's very similar with a lot of the members within this regime. For them, it's just a paycheck. They just want to feed their kids and they want to just have a roof over their heads. So they're just buying their time, waiting for the right opportunity to defect, unite, and mobilize, join the uprisings. They haven't seen that yet, but we're seeing glimpses of it. There has been reports of certain levels of confusion within the regime because of so many top officials being killed. I wouldn't pay too close attention, or I wouldn't put too much emphasis on that, but it kind of speaks to just that level of patience, if you will, with the passive members of the inside buying their time and waiting, because Iran, this regime has been preparing itself for this moment. They knew this moment was going to come, and it was reconfirmed to them with the 12-day war in June. But even before that, well before that, they knew that this day was going to come. And for them, there's really two paths for this regime. It's either we continue to fight until Israel and the United States get tired and realize that there is no end in this for them, no positive end for this, and then they will agree to end the fight. Or we continue to fight until we fall. Anything in between that is a failure. And it's just going to set them up for another conflict, whether it's foreign or domestic. It's just going to set them up for some type of further unrest, further conflict. So for there to be any kind of openness for regime change towards democracy, which the vast majority of Iran. So like I said, if based on internal polling, based on internal domestic voting, because even though voting is rigged in Iran and it's not free and fair, and there is, I mean, it's really not free and fair. But even when people do vote, even when you see, like voter turnout, because well, let me, kind of preface the voting by kind of, giving you a side note as far as the pro-regime protests. Whenever you see those protests, understand that it could be tens of thousands, maybe 100,000. It's never in the millions, no matter what they say. at its peak, it's probably 200,000. But even that, they shuttle their employees to the protests. So it's not, they're not volunteering. The vast majority of them are not volunteering to go and protest or to go support the regime. They're on the payroll, so they have to go. It's a part of, it's like a field trip for them where they just have to go do it. So when you keep that in mind, voting is a bit different in that sense, where they still do shuttle people to go vote, but it's not like a protest. So some people can decide not to vote. Some people So based on those numbers, based on what internal figures that we've been able to piece together that can be almost independently verified, roughly 20% at its best day, 20% of that 93 plus million support this government, either actively or passively, right? So that's 80% of the population who don't. But then of that 80%, you got to think about that, generational differences I was talking about. You got to think about that, psychological element of who can I trust? How can we really unite and mobilize when we don't have a leader? So there's so many layers, there's so many factors and to try to piece things together to see what a more prosperous, peaceful Iran might look like that can be reintroduced into the world community as not being so much a pariah state. Um, I think for me, I think it's we're not going to see real change, like real significant change, internally, until Generation Z, until about 10 years from now, until, Generation Z can really start to unite and mobilize. And that's if there's so many variables that we have to keep in consideration. That's taking into consideration how many of them leave the country and never come back, or, what happens with this war. Because I do agree with Dr. Simmons that there is there is going to be escalation with this war between the US and Iran, but it's not going to be like the kind of ground invasion that we've heard or seen when it comes to the Iraq war. It's going to be much more isolated, much more, strategic, at key sites, But yeah, I mean, I can keep going on. I hope that answered your question, but yeah, it's just so complex.
Yeah, thank you, Reza. A lot more to say certainly, but we do have to wrap this up by 3:15. So I just wanted to mention that, we have heard some really interesting things from both of you folks, and as well as Dr. Rothbart. And it does seem like in the short term we are really set up for some extreme pain within the world, around the world.
Yeah.
But perhaps if there is a possibility of propagating a new narrative around this. And if there are ways that we can reach out to one another as just as people, as citizens of each of our countries, then maybe there could be hope. Dan, I would like to give you the last word to close this out.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there was such insight, Reza, and I see you offered your email address in the
Yeah,
chat. I assume I'm going to hope that you're receptive to people commenting, I assume.
absolutely. Yeah.
But let me just say, that this conversation, and I'll say this to Solon, we'll say this directly to Solon, even though this moment, there needs to be, and this is where our job, when the dominant narrative is militarist, and violence and revenge. This is our job to think of creative ways to undermine that and to foster peace, as we were discussing the key speakers today. So thank you so much for that. Let's do something else together. And it's really an honor that you participated in this event.
Thank
So,
you so much. The honor is mine.
okay.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this. Thanks. Thanks, Randy, for
So
putting this together. It
we're
was great.
we're going to end this right
Yeah.
now. Thank
Well,
you.
so actually, I just wanted
Yeah.
to mention, yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all the audience for joining us. We're going to do our best to have this conversation posted on the Pivot website as soon as we can, since we have recorded this. And yeah, please reach out to Reza and to us at the Pivot Lab to to continue this conversation. It's a really important one. So thanks everyone.
Yeah. Thanks again. Take care.
All
All
right.
right.